Right. Okay. Uh, hey, everybody. Good evening. We'll make a start because it is 7 o'clock or just past seven. So okay. So for this week's Key Stage 3 English, um, we're going to start looking at some of the genres of English that you can get. So this kind of is going to relate more to our literature than our language side of English, but I thought that this it'll set you up in good stead for when you do start to do some more literary texts when you get sort of into your GCSE years. And one that comes up is the Gothic genre. So I've decided this is a good place to start. So, the Gothic genre then. It might be something that you've heard of, it might not. The Gothic genre became popular, particularly within the 18th century, although many of the most famous Gothic novels are Victorian. Um, but the Gothic genre did actually appear first in the 1700s. So the idea of the Gothic genre is to do with your darker novels. So we're looking at having themes of stuff that's darker. So it originates, a bit of history for you, it originates from the Germanic tribe who contributed historically to the fall of Rome and who were believed to be barbaric in nature. And all that means is that they were very violent people. And so the Gothic genre originates from this idea of violence and bloodshed. So that should give you an insight as to what the Gothic genre is really about at its core. But one thing I will say is don't get it confused with horror, because horror deals more with gore and gruesome imagery. However, the Gothic genre does not um, is a separate genre, and horror tends to rely, as I said, on gore and extreme scares, whilst the Gothic genre builds tension by introducing more psychological elements, making the reader think, playing on the reader's association with life as we know it. So don't get it confused with horror. Now, there are certain elements to look out for within the Gothic genre. And all of these can symbolize or convey deeper ideas to the reader based on what was going on at the time. So, certain elements that come up constantly within the Gothic genre can include things like darkness, there being a gloomy setting. So, having things like fog, um, dark weather, storms, rain, all of those things come into the Gothic genre because our gloomy setting can symbolize and represent something deeper about the characters and themes of our novel. They also often tend to include supernatural characters, whether this is vampires, monsters, ghosts, or even just things that are possibly based in reality. We also tend to get an innocent victim, so someone who gets sucked into the plot and things start to change around them and they start to undergo a downfall in character. Um, so we also get things like death and impending morality, things like a hero, possibly. We also get themes such as good versus evil. So for those of you that have studied the Gothic genre already, you might have come across Dracula, or you might have come across Jekyll and Hyde. Both of these cover themes of good versus evil, and they use this to play on the reader's mind and to make them think about morality in everyday life. They may also cover romance, um, create strong and intense emotions, include passionate characters. Some often play on ideas about science, and we'll explore that a little in a little bit. Others can play on this idea of religion. So at the time, as I said, most of these novels kind of came about within the 1800s. And at that time, religion was played a very strong role in people's beliefs at the time. And so these novels sometimes work to counteract people's beliefs about religion, and they play on people's insecurities and religious beliefs in order to tell a deeper message. And another key thing about the Gothic genre is they tend to break away from social norms of the time. And again, we will cover this in a second. But most of all, above everything else, They are there to create mystery. They are there to draw you in, again, make you think about the morality of everyday life. You should never know what's going to happen next in a Gothic novel. Okay, so the first thing to cover is that the Gothic genre is all about setting. And more often than not, a Gothic novel will be set in a dark and gloomy place. As I said, possibly fog, rain, storms. You might often find a spooky castle. So, what is the Gothic setting? The Gothic setting is a spooky or mysterious place where scary stories happen. They help to create a dark and almost creepy, eerie atmosphere that makes the story more exciting and more scary to draw you in as a reader. Common features of such settings include sort of old abandoned castles. So, for example, those of you that might have come across Dracula before. Dracula is set in an abandoned castle in Transylvania. You also get dark forests, wild landscapes, foggy moonlit nights, secret passageways and hidden rooms, ruins and graveyards, and stormy weather. So those of you who've already studied Jekyll and Hyde will be able to tell me what the significance of the fog is in later in the novel. So why are Gothic settings actually important? Why is it important that we build up a dark and gloomy atmosphere? Well, it's above all makes the story feel eerie and tense. And the point of a Gothic novel is that it plays on the reader's insecurities to teach you lessons about what's going on in life. It should make you question your own morality. It should make you question all of your beliefs. It certainly did that to the Victorian readers of the time. The settings also create a feeling of fear and mystery and suspense and reflect the emotions of the characters. So, for example, if I was to set my novel in a dark, abandoned castle, the reason this would create fear and mystery and suspense is because it would place my character into an unknown setting where they didn't know what was going to happen and therefore would create fear. So, we also come across some classic Gothic tropes, and there's certain characters that you might come across in a Gothic novel that play quite a key part to the message and the plot of that novel. These aren't always included, but more often than not, there will be at least one or two of these in pretty much every Gothic novel that you come across. So, firstly, is our creepy aristocrats. So these tend to be the more rich and powerful characters. So, for example, think about Dracula. Dracula is a rich, creepy aristocrat who lives in an isolated castle in Transylvania. They often live in a big, crumbling mansion or charming castle, but something more often than not will feel off about that setting, whether those characters are misunderstood or they're evil. So, Dracula is a great example of a naturally evil character in Gothic genres. However, this could contrast to the more misunderstood Dr. Jekyll in Jekyll and Hyde, who, yes, also lives in a big, rich house, alone and isolated, but that's for a reason, because he's isolated himself, and we misunderstand and begin to learn things about his character as we move on. The creepy aristocrat also often hides dark secrets or has a disturbing past. So in terms of Jekyll and Hyde, which most of you will study at GCSE, Dr. Jekyll hides many secrets, quite literally a second person. And you'll come to learn more about that as you study Jekyll and Hyde. The second type of character that we often find in Gothic novels is the supernatural figure. So again, this doesn't have to be quite literal. It's not always a monster. It could be something more based in reality. For example, ghosts, vampires and witches. And they often break the rules of nature. They often break the rules of nature or death and often create fear and mystery. Sometimes evil, but sometimes misunderstood. So for a good example of a misunderstood creature is Frankenstein's monster, who turned out not to be so evil after all. So, another Gothic character as we previously discussed, is our innocent victim. These people tend to be more often than not, our main characters in a novel, and we will follow their journey as the protagonist and the narrator character in the story as they venture into the unknown and terrible things start to happen around them. So these people tend to be more sort of pure and kind-hearted. Think Mr. Utterson in Jekyll and Hyde. These people tend to be caught up in scary or dangerous situations, often put into grave danger. They often need rescuing or stand up against evil, and the older stories will tend to place the young girls in this character, but as the genre began to progress, we began to see more older male victims also in this genre. So think about Jonathan in Dracula. And then finally, we might also get our anti-hero. So this is someone who's not a typical hero because they don't do good things like a hero normally would. But they don't do bad things. Sometimes they're more interesting characters because they're dark and brooding and often troubled. Um, and sometimes they do bad things, but it's not necessarily for bad reasons. So, a classic anti-hero in the modern day would be someone like Batman. Batman clearly does very questionably or morally questionable things. But does that make him a bad person? Not necessarily. So these people aren't necessarily a hero, but can still be the main characters of the book. Again, think about Dr. Jackal from Jekyll and Hyde. He's not a bad character, he's just someone who's investigating with the boundaries of science. And therefore, that makes him more interesting as a character, because it makes us as the reader more unsure about their morality and what they actually stand for. Okay. So, within the Gothic genre, we also get repeating motifs. And what I mean by motif is kind of a theme. It's something that runs throughout the novel. So I've just highlighted some of the examples, and these could include things like madness. So characters who lose control of their minds, who become obsessed or grief-stricken or overridden by fear, and that can drive them to the edge. This makes a novel so interesting because it plays on the reader's own associations with their own morality and their own psychology. And the motif of madness basically questions our own societal norms and beliefs. We also get themes of change or transition. So these could either be physical changes or emotional changes, something more metaphorical. So this could be a world shifting from normal to terrifying, and Gothic novels often explore the consequences of change. So, for example, again, Jekyll and Hyde, the whole point of that novel is to question changes in scientific advancement compared to traditional religious beliefs. So it questions the need for that change and transition in society. We also get light versus darkness. This is our metaphorical comparison between light and dark. Light often represents safety or truth, whereas our darkness often represents or symbolizes the more fear of the unknown or the danger. We often also get uncertainty. So, whether that's in the character or within the reader, the readers and the characters don't necessarily know what is real or what is happening, whether that's real. So, strange events can occur. We can have unreliable narrators, and we can keep twisting the plot to keep the reader guessing. So whether it's the character or the reader, they should be left in a state of uncertainty because that's what makes it interesting for us to read. We also tend to get themes of duality. So this is our appearance versus our reality. So this tends to represent the differences in human nature. So people or places could look good on the surface, but could be hiding something deeper and darker underneath. So not everything is what it seems. So this is the idea of duality, that people can be two things. And we'll look in a second at why this comes up quite heavily in the novel Jekyll and Hyde. So it's the idea that people on the surface can come across as your respectable, moral, kind person, but behind closed doors, you don't know what they're hiding. So That's the idea of duality. As I said, we also get settings. More often than not, older castles, foggy settings, big houses, but overall something that is isolated. It's important that we get a character isolated because it plays on not only their fears, but the reader's fears as well. The isolation becomes a metaphor for their own insecurity within their own mind and the reader's mind. So, strange settings also are places that feel wrong or unfamiliar, therefore creating mystery and unease. And then finally, we often get themes of power. So, someone controlling or threatening others. This is the sort of surface level of power. However, it could also be metaphorical. So, it doesn't have to be a physical entrapment, it doesn't have to be locked behind bars or kept in a locked room, but it could be emotional entrapment or metaphorical entrapment. And this could be supernatural or it could even be social. And many Gothic stories tend to be about the misuse of power. Okay. So then let's begin to look at context. All I mean by context is what was happening at the time. So we discussed that the Gothic genre came about in the 1700s, but it kind of got bigger in the Victorian 1800s era. So let's explore what was happening at that time. In Gothic literature, science often represents the unknown, the unnatural, or the dangerous pursuit of forbidden knowledge. And during the 18th and 19th centuries, when many Gothic classic novels were written, science was rapidly advancing with discoveries in electricity, anatomy, chemistry, and medicine. And while these breakthroughs were exciting, they also provoked fear and anxiety about humans should go in trying to control or understand nature. So what you find is a lot of Gothic novels play on this idea of trying to understand how far is too far. How far can we go as a race, as a society, to break through the boundaries of our scientific knowledge? And many sort of Gothic novels play on this idea. The main one that you might know is Frankenstein. Frankenstein's monster is quite literally a monster that was brought to life beyond nature's boundaries. And it explores the consequences of this and whether it's a morally okay thing to have done. Similarly, with Jekyll and Hyde, the whole novel, or the whole point of the novel, is to explore the hidden duality behind human intention. Um, so, as Gothic fiction evolved, it began to reflect not only physical science, like our electricity, our chemistry, our anatomy, but also psychology. And at the time, there was a huge scientist at play. His name was Sigmund Freud, and he was the founder of something called psychoanalysis. And what he believed was that the human soul was split into three. He believed that on one hand, we had the ego, this middle person. And the role of the ego was to be representative of us in everyday life. But we also had two things on either side of our ego. One being our id, basically being our primal instincts. So the idea that we're evolved from apes and the id being this representation of those primal ape-like behaviors. So our things associated with violence and murder and all of those things. Whereas our superego on the other side is our guilty conscience. So he believed that a person's ego was the balance between these two things. On one hand, we had the primal instinct, the violence, the aggression, and we had the ego, the superego, the guilty conscience that stopped us from doing these bad behaviors. So the whole point of the novel Jekyll and Hyde is to explore the balance or the duality of human nature. What happens when we give in to our id, to our primal instincts? What are the consequences of this? And we also get this idea of repression. He believed that characters often bury traumatic experiences or dark desires. So we often hide what we truly want or believe. And this plays on a reader's psychology. It plays on the Victorian psychology. It made them question morality in society because it made them look at each other differently. Is it right to repress what we really want? And are there consequences to this repression that actually come out as something darker than if we were just honest about how we felt? So this is significant because Freud's theories actually helped Gothic writers to explore internal terror. So this is how it differs from horror. Horror is very much an external experience. It's about those cheap scares, it's about the gore, the violence. But the Gothic genre is a lot more nuanced. It's about the internal experience of humanity rather than those external scares. And the most frightening horror became not what's outside the character, but what actually lies within our own human mind, within our whole human experience. So, for example, hidden desires, our repressed guilt, our trauma, our fear of losing sanity. And that's what makes the Gothic genre so interesting, because it makes us think about morality in society. Okay. And the reason that Gothic fiction often reflects deep psychological fears is to do with the fear of the unnatural. Scientific experiments often violate natural laws, leading to unnatural consequences that disturb readers on a subconscious level. It also explores the loss of control. Characters who use science to assert power over life or nature often lose control, symbolizing how human vulnerability in the face of forces they do not fully understand. And they also propose the fear of the self. Scientific experimentation in Gothic fiction often exposes a darker side of human nature, suggesting that evil or monstrosity may actually lie within the self, not the supernatural. And that is what makes the Gothic genre so interesting, because it explores how humans really are and the consequences of those choices that we make on a daily basis. It explores the idea of what happens when we take things too far. So the moral and ethical anxiety is also explored. Gothic stories highlight the consequences of pushing moral boundaries in the name of knowledge, creating tension between progress and peril. Okay, then. So we'll also look at the Victorian society in context. So again, context is the history, what's happening at the time, and why and how is this related to the Gothic genre. So then, in Victorian society, men, particularly those of upper or middle classes, were actually expected to embody rationality, self-control, respectability, moral uprightness. So the idea of the gentleman was this calm and composed and gentle man who actually governed by using his brain, governed by logic rather than following emotion. And public reputation, family honor, and social appearances were everything in Victorian society. It was more important to act how people thought you should act than to be yourself. It was important to have those external views about you. So this cultural pressure created a clear divide between what was acceptable on the surface and what had to be hidden beneath. And so this adds to why it's so important in the Gothic genre, because it was all about those suppressed desires. On the surface, men were supposed to be gentle and calm and governed by logic, but underneath, they may have had these darker emotions, darker urges, darker thoughts. And so the Gothic genre often follows the consequences of what would happen if these characters just gave in to those darker thoughts. They often related to the fear of exposure and the loss of control. So, this idea that in a Victorian society, men were supposed to behave a certain way, and if they didn't, they were shunned, they were punished. So, people of that time often were scared of people finding out who they truly were. And so the Gothic genre plays on this. It plays on this idea that people at the time were scared to just be honest about what they actually liked. So the Gothic stories frequently feature characters who fear losing their social standing or being exposed for who they truly are. And this fear becomes a psychological prison in terms of a metaphor and sometimes a literal one, as seen in settings like locked rooms, asylums, or secret labs. This fear of public shame and private ruin is uniquely a Victorian experience and is weaponized in the Gothic genre to create tension. And it also links to the duality of life. Can a person be more than just what they seem on the surface? And that psychological duality reflects the social tension between outward appearance and inner truth. Okay, then. So the final thing we'll cover before we move on to some exercises uh, is in the Gothic genre, you also get certain writing techniques that you may cover later down the line when you do your Gothic genre for GCSE. And this is just ways in which the novel was written. So one way is that the novel could be an allegory. An allegory is basically a story with a hidden message. It's a story that the writer wants you to read and learn something from, because it should reflect a moral question of the time. So it's a story with a hidden meaning beyond the basic plot, which the reader can learn from. Characters, places, or events represent big ideas like fear and guilt, a good versus evil, and they act to reflect the current events and beliefs in society. So, for example, Frankenstein is a story about a monster brought to life, and this can be read as an allegory. It can be read with a hidden meaning that actually, yes, on the surface, it's about a monster coming to life, but on a perceptive, allegorical level, it's about science going too far, and to what extent is this morally wrong? We've talked about juxtaposition in the past few weeks, but the Gothic genre tends to play on this idea of juxtaposition, where two things or two opposing things are placed next to each other to emphasize the contrast between the two. This makes the scary bits feel even scarier by comparing them to something calm or beautiful. So, for example, a peaceful village next to a haunted castle. Those two things represent very contrasting ideas and emphasize something about the story. Another example is in Jekyll and Hyde. We get this contrast between religious beliefs at the time and the scientific advancements, which don't go hand in hand, because the ideas of science at the time were evolution was beginning to become very prevalent. Except evolution heavily contrasts to the current beliefs about Christianity in Victorian England. People believed that there was a creator, there was a God. So the idea of evolution very heavily goes against the idea of a creator because it says that we're evolved from apes. So Jekyll and Hyde plays on this, along with the idea of psychoanalysis, which therefore makes the reader question their own morality, question what is real or not. That is beautiful about the Gothic genre. And then finally, you may also come across an epistolic structure. So this is where the story is told through letters or diary entries or documents. So it's not necessarily told from a direct narration point. It could be told from reading letters from characters. And this makes it feel personal and real, and like you're uncovering secrets. So a good example of this is again Jekyll and Hyde. The last two chapters of the novel are both told through letter writing. And the point of this is to basically uncover secrets that are built up throughout the rest of the novel and help you as a reader to begin to understand what has gone on. So it helps to unravel the mystery that has been created throughout the rest of the novel. Okay. So then, let's get on to our new words for the week. So if you're in year 7 and 8, what I have been doing is I've been encouraging you to learn some new words. And this week is no different. So we're going to do the same thing that we did a couple of weeks ago. We're going to go through these new words, look at the context of the rest of the sentence, and work out how we can deduce what these words actually mean by looking at the context of the sentence that they have been used in. So, right. So the first one then. She felt apprehensive as she stepped into the abandoned church, unsure of what she'd find inside. So let's look at what's in this sentence that helps us deduce or understand what this word apprehensive means. So if I were you, I'd be looking at this unsure of what she'd find out. When I'm unsure, it means I don't know something, or I'm feeling a bit insecure about not knowing that thing. So putting these feelings together of insecurity, security, and this feeling of the unknown can be put together to tell us what apprehensive means. It means the being worried or nervous about something, playing on your insecurities. So it is this idea of feeling worried or insecure, and I'll put the definitions on afterwards. So next, number two. She walked through the dreary halls of the abandoned mansion where even the air seemed tired. So again, we've got this idea of abandoned mansion. The air seemed tired. When I'm tired or when you're tired, you've got a lack of energy. You're feeling drained. The idea of the abandoned, the isolation, the uncomfortable feeling that comes with being alone. Putting these two things together, this idea of tired and lack of energy and isolated, alone, putting these things together tells us what dreary really means. It means something that is dull or bleak or potentially lifeless. Yes, it is something that is dull, bleak, or lifeless. Okay, number three. The walls were decorated with macabre paintings of skeletons and haunted eyes. So we need to look at skeletons and the haunted eyes. When I think of this imagery, it kind of reminds me of something death-like. The only time we really see skeletons are when we've got decomposition happening to the body. And so it reminds me of this idea of death. And so I can say quite confidently that macabre is something to do with death. Now I need to look at how it makes me feel, these words. If I was to come across a skeleton or some sort of haunted eyes that were following me from a painting, I would feel quite fearful. And the genre that this would come into is very horror-like. So I can put two and two together and say that macabre is something that is horrifying, relating to death or injury. Okay, number four. An eerie sound echoed through the empty corridor, sending shivers down her spine. So let's look at this idea of the empty corridor, the shivers down her spine. I don't know if you've ever been in a situation where you've randomly shivered and you've got a compulsive sort of like shivering of your body. We tend to say, or the idiom is that someone's walked over your grave. When we feel a shiver down our spine, this is an idiom that refers to this idea of intense fear. And let's link it to this idea of emptiness. If I was stood in an empty corridor all alone, I would certainly be feeling fear or some sort of feeling of being scared. So I can link again two and two together, and I can say that an eeriness is when we have some sort of scary, strange feeling. So we have apprehensive, which is our idea of being worried by insecurities. We have our dreariness, that is something that is lifeless and bleak. We have our macabre, that is something haunting or horrifying relating to death. And we have these eerie sounds, which are strange and scary. Okay, if you haven't noticed, all of these words are linked or should be linked to our Gothic genre of the week. So number five, he couldn't shake the foreboding that something was watching him from the shadows. Now, foreboding, something that was watching him from the shadows. If I was in the situation and I felt like I was being watched, I would certainly get a sinking feeling. I would feel anxious and scared. And so I can put those things together and deduce that foreboding is this idea that something bad is going to happen, or it's the fear of something bad that could potentially happen to me. The village was completely desolate. Not a single person, not a single light in the windows. So imagine if you walk into a new village and it's in complete pitch black darkness. This feeling, this setting would feel very strange. And to me, something would feel very off. And so I can link that feeling to how I might interpret the word desolate. If there was no life in this village, I would potentially feel very lonely. And the village to me would seem very empty. So again, I can put two and two together and deduce that the word desolate has something to do with the feelingness of empty and being lonely, or something, a setting being empty and lonely. Okay. Number seven, they discovered a gruesome scene in the cellar. Something terrible had happened there. So, something that is gruesome is something that is dark and sinister. It's something that's very unpleasant. It could be, and not always, something that is shocking or violent. So, the word gruesome is something that is disturbing or unpleasant, particularly relating to violence and or being shocking or shock. Okay. The sinister laughter echoed off the stone walls, though there was no one in sight. Now, if the situation happens to me, I will be terrified. So, I can deduce by the way that it's made me feel that it's probably something to do with making me feel scared. Now, I would think, what kind of people or characters or things would make me want to feel fear? Uh, Potentially something evil. So when we talk about something being sinister, it's something that gives the impression of evil, or something or someone that is acting in an evil way, potentially wanting to harm, potentially do harm. She stared out the rain-streaked window filled with a strange melancholy. So, melancholy is often something associated with Shakespearean characters. The idea of melancholy is relating to a type of sadness. And the way that I can deduce this from the sentence is that if I was staring out of the rain-streaked window, I would certainly feel quite sad as well. I would feel quite lonely and isolated. I think just the idea of rain generally creates a feeling of sadness. Well, nobody loves the rain. So an apparition hovered over the grave, glowing faintly in the dark fog. So this idea of glowing then, glowing faintly in the dark fog. No human does this. Nobody glows. So it tells her that it is something unnatural. And what things are unnatural, particularly found in graveyards, are ghosts. So an apparition is a fancy term for a ghost-like being. And then finally, he took a tentative step forward, unsure if the old floorboards would hold his weight. So again, we're playing on this idea of uncertainty. If we're uncertain or unsure whether to do something, we may approach it with hesitance before we make a solid decision. So the idea of doing something tentatively is doing something with hesitation, uh, being not fully confident. Okay. So I will put the answers on now in case you wanted to take a screenshot, in case you wanted to save these words. So apprehensive with his idea of being worried or nervous. The idea of being dreary is something dull, bleak, and lifeless. Something that is macabre is horrifying, especially if it involves death or injury. The idea of something being eerie is something that's strange and scary. The foreboding is a feeling of something bad's going to happen. Something that's desolate is something that feels empty, lonely, and without life. Something that is gruesome is extremely unpleasant. To do something sinister, it gives the impression of something evil or harmful. If something is melancholy, it's this feeling of sadness or gloom. An apparition is a ghost, and to do something tentatively is to do something with hesitation or uncertainty. So those are the words that we're gonna put together today in the next 20 minutes. So what I've got lined up next is a fill in the blank activity that we're going to do together using these 10 words so that we can begin to understand what they mean. So, the first one then, the sky was grey and the rain never stopped. It was truly a something day. Okay, so in this space, I'm looking for something that describes something that is potentially sad. I'm looking for something that's potentially gloomy, something that's depressing. The idea or the word that I'm looking for here is the word dreary. So we came across dreary. It means something that is bleak or lifeless. Um, so dreary is the one that we're looking for here to describe the weather. We can describe humans as dreary, but more often than not, it is to describe the weather. So, number two, she felt something as she stepped into the old library, unsure of what she might find. So, again, we've got this idea of uncertainty, of not knowing what you might find. So, there were two words relating to this. There was apprehensive and there was tentative. Now, apprehension would be the one that we're looking for. If I was feeling apprehensive, I'm doing something worried. Whereas to do something tentatively is with hesitation or, well, uncertainty or not fully confident. So either one would fit here, but the one that I'm going to go with is apprehensive, the idea of worry. Apprehensive. Okay. He took a something step across the rotting floorboards, afraid they might collapse. So again, we've got this idea of uncertainty, this fear to do something. And the one that I'm looking for here then is tentative. The adjective tentative. So a strange flickering light floated through the graveyard. It looked like a something or an something. So let's think about this idea, the floating. What kind of things float, especially through a graveyard? It's our ghosts. And what word was it that meant ghost? It was our apparition. So this entire village had been abandoned, silent, and something. So we've got clues in the sentence. We've got the idea of the village being abandoned. So it gives this idea of emptiness. The idea that it's silent, it's unsettling, gives this idea of loneliness. And what word linked to this? This was our desolate setting. Something that is empty, alone, sometimes scary, but something that's isolated. Number six, then, the hallway was filled with a something silence, broken only by the distant sound of footsteps. So if I was in a room, imagine you're in your bedroom at night, you wake up in the middle of the night and you hear footsteps outside. This would be a feeling that would instill fear in you. And so you'd be wondering what these strange noises are. And what was a word that encompassed this idea of being strange and scary? It was this idea of being eerie or something being eerie. So strange and scary. Okay, number seven then. Bones and twisted dolls were scattered across the attic in a truly something display. So we need a word here that's going to highlight the feelings that you would fear in this that you would feel in this situation. And if I saw this display, I'd be pretty scared. I'd be pretty horrified. And the idea that relates to something being horrifying because it relates to death-like imagery or something that is resulting in imagery is our macabre display. So, our macabre display. So he had a strong feeling of something, like something terrible was about to happen. So let's look at this. Something terrible was about to happen. If I have a feeling that something bad is going to happen, it is a foreboding feeling that I fear. It's this idea that I'm scared that something bad is going to happen in my future. And we can use it's a good word to use if you're writing about in literature, GCSE. Because if something is foreboding, even in language, if this comes up, if something is foreboding, it makes you feel like something bad is going to happen. So, for example, in language GCSE, you might come across a description of some stormy weather that's been personified to basically convey violence and aggression. I would argue this is a foreboding feeling towards something negative happen later down the line. So number 9, a portrait hung at the end of the corridor. Its subject wearing a something smile that made her shiver. So I'm looking for a word to do with evil, something that's scary, something that could do you harm. And all of these words relate to my sinister smile, something that makes you feel that could do you harm. So, after reading the letter, he was filled with something, thinking of what could have been. So, the idea of thinking of what could have been often relates to an idea of feeling sad or regret. And which of our words related to sadness? It was our melancholy. And then finally, the crime scene was too something to describe. Even the police looked away. So this idea that even the police looked away tells us the image must have been absolutely horrifying. And what word links to violence and horror? It is our gruesome imagery. Okay. So I hope you're beginning to understand how we can use these words in sentences. And I encourage you, like I did 2 weeks ago, to use these at home. Learn how we can use these in essays because these are very useful things that could come up in your creative writing or your language analysis or even just everyday life. But especially when you do your Gothic genre novel at GCSE. Okay then. So we'll quickly move on to reading today's Gothic story, which uses these words, and it should give you an idea of ways that we can use these words when it comes to it. So let's have a look. So then, uh, slide. Okay then. So the wind howled through the broken windows of Daggermore Hall, a dreary, crumbling estate perched on the edge of the moors. It had been abandoned for decades, and its name had become something whispered in town, never spoken aloud after dark. Eleanor approached the iron gates with tentative steps, clutching the crumpled invitation in her coat pocket. The paper was yellowed, the ink faded, and though it bore no sender, it had clearly been written by hand. She was apprehensive, and not just because of the hall's dark reputation. The letter had arrived after midnight, slid under her door without a sound. It had only said one thing: return before the moon is full, and that was tonight. The front doors groaned open by themselves, revealing the hall's vast, decaying interior. It was colder inside than it had been on the moors. She paused, her breath misting in the air, and took in the space before her. The entrance hall stretched out before her like a forgotten cathedral. Cobwebs hung from the rafters like grey lace, and thick layers of dust colonized every surface, dulling once grand chandeliers and cracked oil paintings. The walls, once rich in burgundy, were faded and torn like peeling skin. An enormous staircase curved upwards into darkness, its wooden steps warped and splintered. A chandelier swung gently above her, creaking on a frayed chain, though there was no breeze. The scent of mildew and something faintly macabre, like rotting flowers or long-dried blood, clung to the air. Portraits lined the halls, their faces warped by time, their eyes seeming to follow her sinister stare. The silence was not peaceful, it was thick, watching, waiting. Each footstep she took echoed far too loud. She moved with care, her shoes brushing through dust that hadn't been disturbed in years. The only light came from the silver slice of moonlight leaking through a broken stained glass window. As she walked further, she passed a child's toy carriage, overturned and broken, as though someone had dropped it mid-play and never returned. The further she went, the stronger sense of foreboding grew. She came to a door, slightly ajar at the end of the hallway, pushing it open. She entered what must have been once the ballroom. Now it was desolate, a graveyard of splintered furniture and shredded curtains. A grand piano stood alone in the corner, a single key pressed down by nothing at all. As she watched, it lifted. From the cracked mirror across the room, a flicker of movement caught her eye. She turned sharply. There was nothing behind her, but the mirror showed otherwise. In the reflection, a pale figure hovered, long hair drifting above her like smoke. An apparition. It turned slowly, and Eleanor's breath caught. The face was familiar, sunken, sorrowful, but unmistakably, her grandmother's. The one who had vanished from this place 15 years ago. A wave of melancholy swept over Eleanor. Tears pricked her eyes as she reached towards the mirror, but the glass suddenly cracked with a shriek. The image was gone in an instant. A wave of melancholy. A rustling sound echoed from the stairwell above. Tentatively, she turned towards it. Hello, she called out. No answer. Then came the gruesome parts. Something thudded down the stairs, slow, deliberate, a dragging sound. Eleanor backed into the ballroom, her hand over her mouth. The chandelier flickered violently above her. Laughter, eerie, high-pitched, and unearthly, spilled from the shadows. She realized then she hadn't been invited to Dagmar Hall. She had been summoned, and she would not leave alone. Okay, so for the last 10 minutes of this first section then, let's begin to work through some comprehension questions for this story. Because these are the kind of questions that you could get in an exam of different exam boards. So then, let's look back and think about what words and phrases are used to describe the hall and set, particularly the Gothic genre or the Gothic mood. Okay, so let's look back through the story then and think about what makes it Gothic. So things that I picked up are stuff like the broken windows is a good example. The iron gates. So the broken windows, the abandoned nature of the house, the darkness of the night, the ironclad gates. We could also talk about the whispering in town. All of this creates a very Gothic setting, something that is dark and gloomy. We also get this imagery of the wall peeling like skin, this almost macabre, which relates to our horrifying things relating to injury and death, creates this Gothic, gloomy, terrifying setting. Makes the reader and the character very uncomfortable as they're unsure what's to come next in the story. We get this idea of splintering and warping, these ideas that things aren't exactly as they seem, adding to this idea of uncomfortability. The fact that there was no breeze, there was mildew and rotting flowers, this imagery of the rotting, of the decay of the blood, all of these things I use to describe the hall and set this Gothic mood. This idea of something that is horrifying, uneasy, and creates uncertainty and mystery in the reader. So uncertainty, unease, and uncertainty. Okay, question 2 then. How does Eleanor feel as she enters the hall? So this comes back to one of our new key words. It tells us that she was feeling apprehensive and tentative. And these words, as we saw above, were to do with this feeling of hesitation. She was worried to go in. So how does she feel? What words are used? the idea of being tentative or apprehensive, which is our idea of worry, hesitation, therefore hinting that something bad is going to happen. Okay, what details create a sense of foreboding, which is hinting that something bad is going to happen, or suspense? So it tells us that there was a thick, something was watching her. It had a sinister stare. It said the silence was not peaceful. It was thick, watching, waiting. So to me, this is the main quote that gives me a sense of foreboding, this idea that something bad is going to happen because just the words, the watching, the waiting, this idea of time or somebody waiting in the shadows, waiting to jump out, lurking to do me harm. Okay. Question four. How do the words macabre, sinister, and gruesome help to create a darker atmosphere? Okay, so let's start with macabre. This idea of being macabre is something that is horrifying because it relates to death and disease and injury. So this idea of being horrifying. So the reason this creates a darker atmosphere is because it relates to something that's morbid. It plays on the reader's insecurities. It plays on the reader's associations with this darker imagery of their associations with death and our own fear of death, our fear of what comes after death, why that is so scary because no human alive knows. And so this macabre imagery helps to create that darker atmosphere, that mood that the reader fears or feels. And it is something horrifying. Okay, so the sinister, how does this create a darker atmosphere? Well, the idea of something being sinister is something waiting to attack, it's waiting to do us harm. And so it creates a feeling of unease, a feeling of fear, um, because it suggests an evil presence. It suggests that something is following her, which to me creates a very unsettling atmosphere. And then finally, how does gruesome helps create a darker atmosphere? Well, again, this idea of death and violence and aggression is something that is inherently and innately scary to all humans. Nobody wants to be harmed. Nobody wants to be hurt. And so it kind of prepares the reader to feel unsettled and fearful because it preys on our own associations and our own insecurities about death. Okay, so I will leave it there for today, but feel free to have a think about the remaining comprehension questions as we move on to our GCSE section of today's session. Right. Right then. Okay, so has anyone got any questions before we move on? I'll look at the chat, but I noticed that nobody's said anything this week. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. I'm happy to answer them. Otherwise, we'll move on to our GCSE language portion of this evening. And we're going to continue our theme of looking at language. So last week was a bit different. We did a bit of a revision session on language, English language paper one for our year 11s that we're going to be sitting at GCSE. Open the webinar chat. Sorry, I've just seen the things in the chat. So, someone said, what does macabre mean? So, macabre is the idea of something feeling horrifying because it relates to death and relates to injury. And that's what makes it horrifying. Do you think Macbeth is light or darkness? Well, that's a tricky one because the Macbeth as a character is very conflicted. He's a bit different because Macbeth is not the Gothic genre. Macbeth is a tragedy. So Macbeth begins as a tragic hero. He's someone who is celebrated. He's someone who's valiant. But by the end of the play, he's taken a tragic downfall. He's committed terrible acts of murder and violence. And so he's really neither light nor dark. But I guess if he was one of them, he would be darkness. I guess he relates to our idea of duality in a way, that people can be multiple things. That on the surface, they can seem valiant, but really deep down, they have this guilt and these ambitious desires. Okay, what tips would you give us for the speaking English exam at the end of year 10? So presentation skills is everything when it comes to public speaking. It's all about confidence. So I'd pick a topic that you feel confident on to begin with, something that you feel you could talk a lot about. And I'd structure it. Make sure that you have a solid structure that flows and be confident when you speak. That's really the key to presentation skills, is just being able to articulate your ideas and your beliefs well. Okay, right, I'm going to move on because we need to start this next section of GCSE. Sorry, I'm just reading the chat. The word for hero, a character's tragic downfall. So the word for hero or tragic downfall. So we have multiple words in tragedy. So when it comes to Macbeth, he's a tragic hero. And what that means is he starts at a high level. He starts very valiantly. At the beginning of the play, we see him celebrated for his efforts in war. But throughout the play, he does several questionable things. Some worse than others. I mean, he commits murder multiple times. He plans multiple people's murder. And by the end of it, he's become a shell of the person that he once was. And so he's a tragic hero because he's undergone a downfall. He's gone from this high point to the low. And there's several words that come within that. So we get a hamartia, which is this idea of a fatal flaw. So in terms of Macbeth, his fatal flaw is ambition. He seeks power and will do anything to get it. And he gets overwhelmed by over ambition. We also get this idea of peripeteia, which is the moment in the play in which the tragic hero basically gets past the point of no return. So in Macbeth, I would argue it is Act 3, Scene 4, where he sees Banquo's ghost. That for him, that is the realization point, that he cannot come back, cannot repent for his actions. His actions have become unjustifiable. They've become unrepentable. There's no way back from his actions. Okay, so language week 2 then. Last week, let's remind ourselves what we looked at. We looked at question 2 is part of the general revision of Year 11 English Language Paper 1. And Paper 1, this is an 8-mark question. Last week, we looked at the 2023 hyena question, except this week, we're going to look at the 2018 T-Rex question. So question 2 will always look like this. It will always say, read from lines A to Z, and how does the writer use specifically language, notice how I've highlighted language, to describe X, Y, Z. So in this particular example, it's how does the writer use language to describe the T-Rex? And we're going to go through this together. But again, I'm going to reiterate my advice. I would always stick to 3 Peter paragraphs because this is an 8-mark question. I would read the question before the extract, and then I would highlight language devices as you go through, just so that it's better to read the question before, because then you know what to look for as you read through it. I'd always make sure to make clear points about words and devices, trying to think perceptively beyond literal intentions. And I'm going to remind you later on how we do this step by step. And as well, choosing a range of quotes and language devices, because you get marks on this. You get marks from picking out and being able to accurately state a range of language devices. And then as a general tip, I would always try and link either tone or atmosphere to the effects of the reader, because it already ticks off two language devices whilst you're making an explanation. So it win-win. Okay, so a quick reminder of our PETA points, our PETA paragraphs. PETA stands for point, evidence, technique, explanation, and the effects on the reader. So in terms of making a point, it's wanting you to state a clear point that answers the question directly. So for example, what is the writer trying to show in our dinosaur example? What is it trying to show about the dinosaur beyond the literal stated things? Number two, evidence. This is choosing appropriate quotes or relevant quotes to back up your point. So choosing a precise quote that does this. Number three, technique. Identify accurately the correct techniques within that quote. So what technique is being used? Is it a simile? Is it metaphor? Is it sentence structure? Is it juxtaposition? And then an explanation, explaining in depth how the writer supports your point, or how that technique supports your point. So picking apart keywords. What do your associations about that word tell you perceptively about what is going on in this extract? And then finally, effect on the reader. So how does it make you think or feel, and how does that link to what you just said about your explanation? Okay, so last week we looked at how to write a high-level answer, and I'm going to briefly just kind of go over this. Notice that I've changed the example this week to fit our dinosaur text that we're going to do. And we'll come back to this, but to get that higher level 8 out of 8 answer, you want to be using sophisticated and accurate subject terminology. This refers to, have you stated techniques? Have you said metaphor, symbolism, tone, adjectives, nouns, juxtaposition? Have you named them correctly and used enough of them to get higher marks? It's also asking you for a judicious range. That just means, have you got a wide range? Have you used many quotes to support your argument? And then have you analyzed the effect of the writer's choices? So have you made perceptive points beyond the literal? Have you just stated or rewritten what's already in the text? Because really we're looking for perceptive points. Okay. So let's begin to summarize some of the key terms that we've come across. So a couple of weeks ago, we started breaking them down. And we looked specifically at these 5 things. Tone and atmosphere are kind of in the same ballpark. So the tone refers to the attitude or the mood conveyed by the writer's choices. So this is the style of writing. And it influences how the reader feels about the text, creating a specific emotional response. And that emotion is the atmosphere. So for example, I said a sarcastic tone can make the reader either feel amused or critical. So the tone influences how we see the writing or what we think about the writing. And then the atmosphere is the mood. So the difference between tone and atmosphere is that the tone is specifically how the writer has written, and the atmosphere is how that then makes us feel or think. So the atmosphere refers specifically to the mood created in the reader, and it shapes how the reader feels as they experience the story, such as a sense of dread, joy, excitement, or calm. So for example, a story set in a dark, abandoned house, such as that Gothic genre, might create an ominous or eerie atmosphere, while a sunny beach scene might evoke a peaceful and relaxed atmosphere. And then we also started to pick apart 3 different language techniques. We looked at imagery, and imagery, as a reminder, comes into like 80–90% of everything that you'll get in an extract. If you can see it in your head as you read it, that is imagery. So descriptive language that appeals to the senses and helps the reader visualize and experience the scene, therefore making the text more vivid and engaging. And then we also looked at symbolism. So Symbolism is when symbols are used to present larger concepts or larger ideas, when something represents something else. So we tend to select something non-human and basically relate it to these larger ideas. It adds a deeper meaning to the text. And it's our symbolism that basically allows for us to make perceptive points beyond the literal. It allows us to interpret things differently. So, for example, a dove representing peace or a silver trophy representing success. And then we looked at the semantic fields. And these are just groups of words that are related in meaning. So it's words that are within the same theme and basically belong to the same topic or theme. So writers use semantic fields to create a particular mood, to reinforce an idea, or to emphasize a specific theme in a text. So by using words from the same semantic field, a writer can subtly guide the reader's thoughts and emotions. So for example, a semantic field of war might include words like battle, conflict, attack, soldier, victory, weapon, and all of those contribute to an aggressive or violent tone. Okay, then. So we talked about tone linking to the effects of the reader, because my tip is that you should always include it when in that section of your paragraph, of your Peter paragraph about the effects of the reader. So tone and atmosphere influence how the reader is affected. They are created by the reader's ability to infer something from the connotations of certain words. And it is the use of other language techniques that provide these connotations. So a connotation is basically how a word makes you think, how a word or what a word makes you think about. How do you associate that word with something else? And it's these associations that let us make perceptive points. However, it's the use of other language techniques that provide the connotations, such as our symbolism. So tone and atmosphere are at the basis of how the writing makes us feel and determine what we take away from the story and what we think about the characters. Okay, and I've given you some examples of how different atmospheres and tones could make you feel. I'm not going to read through all of these. I've just left them there in case you want to save them for you to use if you're ever stuck in terms of interpreting language and text. So I've put the type of atmosphere, the type of tone, and I followed it by the effect that it has on the reader. So I'm going to leave these here 10, 20 seconds. If you want to take a picture of these, please do so now before I move on. And I'll read the chat while you have a look through some of these. So the reason that I don't do PTEC is because context kind of more refers to literature. So in terms of language, we don't really use PTEC because there's not really context that comes into it. Context is more like history of what's going on. So if I was to do a paragraph about characters in Macbeth, sure, I'd use context because I need to support my point with what's happening at the time it was written. Because that basically helps to determine how it makes the reader feel and what we think about. But I don't really use PTEC in language because there's not really context behind the language paper, but there is in literature. So if we ever cover any literature, I will use PTEC because that is technically the correct thing I would recommend using in literature. Uh, bu- 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 bu. Okay then. So again, I'll leave these here just for 30 seconds. Again, the effect of tones on the reader. So how different tones can make you feel. And again, these shouldn't be something that you directly copy or that you need to know, but they're there to guide you if you ever get stuck with analyzing or creating a full explanation in a Peter paragraph. So if you ever come across something and you feel like the tone is very reflective, for example, and you don't know how to write and how to effectively convey what it makes the reader think or feel, use these examples because they directly relate to these tones. So they're there to help you as a guide. I know a lot of people struggle with how to write a piece of paragraph. So I'm just trying to help you basically begin to structure one based with phrases that you could write. Okay, so then we looked at symbolism, imagery, and semantic fields. And this week we're going to move to talk a little bit more specifically about these three techniques. A metaphor, a simile, and personification, something that I hope you all already are familiar with. So a metaphor is a direct comparison between two things, except we're not using the words like or as. It emphasizes meaning by associating one thing with another, which adds depth and understanding. So in a metaphor, we say something is something else, or something was something else. It's a direct comparison. So for example, time is a thief, compared to a simile, which uses like or as. So it's still a comparison between two things, except this time we're saying it is like or as something else, and it enhances understanding by making abstract ideas more tangible. It helps the reader to visualize ideas or emotions to enhance emotional impact, very similar to a metaphor, and enhances the tone and mood. So, for example, her smile was as bright as the sun. And then we get personification, which is pretty much as it sounds. This is when we give non-human things human characteristics. So, for example, inanimate objects or abstract concepts become more relatable or vivid. And this deepens the symbolism of those objects to emphasize emotions. So, for example, the wind whispered by personifying the wind, we're making it feel like a scary force. Whereas if I just said the wind blew through the trees, you'd have no association with that. Whereas because I've given it human qualities, it makes you as a reader feel something. And in this case, fear. Okay. So then, I want to clear something up because there are slight nuances between similes and metaphors. Not huge differences, but still differences that you should be aware of in terms of how it makes the reader think or feel. So it's worth saying that similes and metaphors both compare things. However, and both of them use imagery and symbolism through the connotations of the words to convey ideas and emotions. But they do this in very nuanced, small, different ways. So a simile uses words like or as, whereas metaphor is a direct comparison using is or was. Similes feel gentler, whereas metaphors kind of feel stronger and more poetic. And we'll look at this example. So as a simile, her voice was like music, but as metaphor, her voice was music. So by changing slightly the way that we say it from like to was, it creates slightly different associations or connotations. So, for example, in a simile, if I said her voice was like music, this suggests something quite pleasant or enjoyable. Because when I think about music, I mean, I personally love music. I think it makes me feel calm, it makes me feel happy. And so I associate music with those things, therefore creating a light and calm atmosphere. The tone, the way that the writing is presented, is something that is affectionate, and therefore the reader sees her voice as soothing and rhythmic, and it instills happiness in anyone who hears it. However, if I said that if her voice was music, this direct comparison suggests her voice is almost pure beauty. It's art itself. So the slight difference here. The simile, yeah, okay, still says that her voice is enjoyable, it's calming, but it's not got that passion behind the message. The metaphor gives it a stronger, harder hitting message, almost saying that she is music herself. She is the embodiment of this concept, this all-consuming concept. So it almost creates a more magical and romantic atmosphere. And the tone goes from being something that is affectionate to being something that is idealized. It's almost as if on one side you've got this character who's falling in love with a simile, saying that her voice is like music. He's falling in love. Whereas a metaphor is someone who is head over heels in love. It's someone who's infatuated, who can't get enough. It's idealized, it's intense. And the reader sees her voice as transformative or enchanting, which tells us how deeply the narrator feels about the woman as we view music as a necessary part of daily life. It is addictive. He is deeply in love with her and cannot live without her. He is infatuated, compared to our simile, which gives the connotations of similar things, but does so in a gentler way, whereas our metaphor is hard-hitting and solid. So both compare her voice to music, but the metaphor deepens that emotional impact, changing the tone and the atmosphere and making the reader feel more awe and wonder. Okay. So last week we also looked at how to make a solid perceptive point. So when I say perceptive, I mean something that's beyond literal intentions. So for example, last week we looked at the hyena, and the hyena was described as having skin that reflected human infection. So on a literal level, we could have argued, yes, the hyena um, was just ugly. But let's go perceptive. Perceptive means, what does that actually mean? Yes, okay, is an ugly hyena. But what does that actually mean on a metaphorical, deeper level? So, step one, let's start with a clear interpretation. Instead of saying what is happening, say what the writer might be showing or suggesting. So, for example, instead of saying the writer uses a simile to describe the spots, say the simile suggests the hyena's appearance is so unpleasant it's compared to something diseased. So this just frames our point in a more perceptive way. Step two is to then start to pick out the connotations of specific words. So in this quote, we have the noun of disease. So yes, disease is something that's ugly, but what can we say about that on a more perceptive, deeper level? So consider how these words make you feel. So when you're ill, how do you feel when you're ill? How do you feel when you're around ill people? Disease has negative connotations. It makes you feel uncomfortable. It's something that's unnatural. We don't go around our normal lives being ill. We go around our normal lives being healthy. So being ill is something that's not normal. It's not something that's part of daily life. To be sick is for your body to not be working properly. So therefore, it suggests that the hyena is not just ugly, which is our literal point, but it's actually wrong and offensive. It's as if it doesn't belong in nature. It's unnatural and repulsive. And this creates disturbing imagery, making the hyena seem contaminated or even disgusting to look at. Okay, so we can then build on this idea and thinking about how we link it to tone or the wider message. So we need to think about how the writer wants you to feel and why. So for example, the tone is cruel and mocking, which makes the description feel harsh and exaggerated. The writer might be showing how people judge animals based on appearance, suggesting an underlying bias or prejudice. And this encourages the reader to question the narrator's reliability. So we need to start asking ourselves, how do these words make us feel? What do I think in association to these words? What's the tone like? How does that tone make me feel as a reader? And how can I link it to my point? And then if there is juxtaposition, start to bring in the contrast between things. But we won't look at juxtaposition today because we're focusing on metaphors, personification, and similes. Okay, so this brings us on. This brings us on to our activity portion. So this is where I'm going to give you your 5 minutes. Okay, so I'll give you 5 minutes. I want us to start thinking about this and then we'll sort of move on. We're thinking specifically about metaphors and similes and how to create a Peter paragraph. So for each quote below or to the side, I want you to analyze the connotations of each key word or image. I want you to think about how it shapes the tone and the atmosphere and how it describes the effect on the reader. So how each metaphor and simile can be made into a perceptive point. So yes, for example, the first one, the classroom was a furnace. Yes, on a literal level, the classroom was hot. But what else? How does it make you feel? What do you think about? What's the tone like? What's the atmosphere? How does it make you feel as a reader? So I'm going to give you 2 or 3 minutes as a little break to have a think about this. And then we're going to go on to answer these and then look at a past paper example. So take 2 minutes, have a think about these. Right then. Right, let's start thinking about these. So the first one then, the classroom was a furnace. Yes, on a very literal level, we can think about the room being hot. But is there anything on a deeper, more perceptive level that we can consider about this idea of the furnace? So let's start to pick it apart. Let's start to pick about the connotations of this word furnace. So, what do you think about when you think about the word furnace? Um, yeah, it's something that's hot, but on a more perceptive level, how does it make you feel? If I was in a furnace, I'd feel somewhat overwhelmed, somewhat confined in a space. So we can link this idea of the furnace, idea of the furnace, to this idea of being overwhelmed and overpowered, this idea of physical exhaustion. So, yes, it is hot, but in hot scenarios, there's this physical exhaustion, which creates what kind of tone? If I was in that sort of scenario, I could argue that this tone is quite oppressive. It's something that it is very uncomfortable to be in. So we have an uncomfortable and oppressive tone linking to this idea of physical exhaustion and being overwhelmed. And then what is the effect on the reader? Well, we feel as the character feels. So if they feel discomfort, we feel discomfort, which creates this idea of tension. So yes, on a literal level, the room was hot, but it makes you feel stifled. It's oppressive, it's uncomfortable, it's exhaustion, it's very tense. So all of those things I could link to my furnace. What about the city was a beast? On a literal level, the city, it cannot literally be a beast. So we need to think perceptively. What do we associate or what connotations come with this word? It's something powerful, something again overwhelming. It's a force to be reckoned with, potentially something aggressive and violent. So, thinking about this on a metaphorical level, um, it almost paints the city as something that is alive. It's an example of our personification, something that is almost untamed or undomesticated. So, what tone does this create? How does it make the reader feel in the atmosphere created? I would argue that, again, it kind of presents the city as almost having a mind of its own. So, mind of its own. Um, and presents the city as being alive almost. Like it has its own thoughts and feelings. It's almost an intimidating place to be. It's um, almost something that you should be in awe of, that possesses great power. So the idea of presenting the metaphor of the beast presents this city as being very overwhelming, something intimidating, something that you should or be scared of. But also, on the other hand, could be something that is actually quite fascinating and interesting. Okay, so hope is a fragile grass. Let's focus on this glass element first. So when I think about glass, I think about how it's breakable. It is very delicate. So if we're comparing hope to something that is delicate and breakable, what does that suggest on a perceptive level about hope? It suggests that it's almost easily destroyed, which is almost a very bleak image. It's a very pessimistic way to look at hope. So I guess that links to our tone is almost a very pessimistic tone. It's something that is quite bittersweet, I guess. It's a very sad tone. It almost makes you therefore feel sympathy for the reader, for the character. So as a reader, we feel sympathy for the character because of what they're going through. And this idea being emphasized, or the metaphor being emphasized by the fragile nature of the grass, something that is easily breakable. And therefore, we as a reader feel vulnerable because, like the character, we are also prone to our lives shattering. And again, very oppressive and pessimistic tone or view of hope in a metaphor. Okay, moving on to these similes then. Let's think about he moved through the room like a shadow. So this idea of picking apart the connotations of the word shadow. When I think about a shadow, I think of something that is in the darkness. And what do I associate with darkness? It's almost something unknown, something scary. So the idea of the unknown. And in humans, we feel pretty ingrained. It's almost innate that we have a fear of the unknown. A fear of darkness is almost drilled into all of us at a young age because we don't know what's coming. So what tone is created? Almost one of mystery, one of suspense. It's a very ominous tone, very eerie tone. Something that makes us feel very uncomfortable, therefore. The reader feels suspense. We feel unsettled, as if something is following us. Um, we feel uneasy. If something is hidden in the shadows, it almost presents the thing that's moving through the room to be doing so in a very stealthy, careful way, which therefore adds to this ominous and eerie tone because it makes you feel like someone is following you and doing so with a purpose. Okay, let's quickly move on. So the news hit her like a punch in the stomach. So this idea of the punch is something very violent. So obviously news on a literal level can't punch, but again, we've got this personification. And why does that personification emphasize our simile? Because this idea of violence. this idea of pain. Um, Therefore, how does that make the reader feel? If someone was to gut punch you, it'd be this feeling of unease, this feeling of almost pushing you off balance. So it's the um, creating shock, this idea of shock in the reader, um, creating this idea of physical impact being linked to emotional impact. So, yes, literally, it's talking about physical violence, but on a metaphorical level or a simile level, it's talking about the emotional pain or the emotional hit or vulnerability, which makes the reader feel the emotional weight of whatever the character is going through. Because it's a very sensitive topic, so it gives the idea of sensitivity. It tells us that whatever the character is going through, it's something very meaningful and deep. Okay, and then finally, her voice was as warm as freshly baked bread. So when I think about bread, the idea of something being freshly baked always makes me feel very warm and comfortable on the inside. It's a very cozy feeling. So I associate this with something that's almost related to my childhood. It's almost something that is comforting, something that is hearty, something that reminds me of home. So if her voice is being compared to this feeling that I feel in association with the noun of bread, it might make me as a reader be filled with warmth, filled with comfort, feel safe, feel at home. All of these things, it presents a very calm sort of tone and makes me feel very safe. So I hope you can see that by the connotations of specific words, we can begin to pick apart and create perceptive points beyond the literal, using the connotations created in the metaphors and similes. Okay, then. So let's look or begin to take a look at this week's extract. So last week we looked at the hyena, but this week we're going to use the 2018 paper looking at a dinosaur. So as I read through this, begin to make a mental note or a physical note of things relating specifically to metaphors, personification, similes. I'm going to write these out. Metaphors, personification, and similes, please. So, metaphors, personification, and similes. And I've picked this specifically for this week because this extract is filled with those things. It is rife with metaphors. So there's lots to pick out of this extract. So it says from lines 16 to 26, how does the writer use language to describe specifically the T-Rex? So it came on great, oiled, resilient striding legs. It towered 30 feet above half of the trees, a great evil god, folding its delicate watchmaker's claws closely to its oily reptilian chest. Each leg was a lower piston. 1,000 pounds of white bone sunk in thick ropes of muscle, sheathed over in a gleam of pebbled skin, like the armor of a terrible warrior. Each thigh was a ton of meat, ivory and steel mesh. And from the great breathing cage of the upper body, those two delicate arms dangled out front, arms with hands which might pick up and examine men like toys, while the snake neck coiled. And the head itself, ton of sculpted stone, uh, lifted easily upon the sky, its mouth gaped, exposing a fence of teeth like daggers. Its eyes rolled, ostrich eggs. empty of all expression save hunger. It closed its mouth with a death grin. It ran its pelvic bones, crushing aside trees and bushes, its taloned feet clawing damp earth, leaving prints 6 inches deep wherever it settled its weight. Okay, then. So I hope you've noticed as I've gone through, I've started to color code certain things. So I've done metaphors in pink, personification in blue, and similes in the yellow color. So let's start to pick apart in a perceptive way how we could make perceptive points about these things. So, firstly, then, let's begin with the great evil God. Because this is a really wonderful thing to pick apart about this extract. What do we associate with the word God? I think it's something that is associated with almost a higher power, some sort of deity. And what kind of things do we think about when we associate with higher power? It's something that is maybe all powerful. Now, a god doesn't have to be something evil. We can get benevolent gods. We can get gods that are all loving and all knowing. But I think the fact that we've added this adjective of evil almost um, adds to the idea that this is not an all-loving God, but something that is out to do harm. And because it is all-powerful, we as a reader should therefore fear it. So it instills fear in the reader because of our associations with the connotations of that noun of God. Okay, therefore, what kind of tone are we getting from this great evil God? I think it is something that is quite intimidating. It's almost an intimidating tone. It's something that is unsettling, something that is ominous. All of these are great words to describe the atmosphere and the tone. So yeah, to summarize, I've worked on the connotations of the gods as something that's all-powerful. The adjective tells me that it's probably something to do me harm, but because it's all-powerful, it creates a feeling of intimidation, of being unsettled, and it's therefore something that I should fear. Okay, adding to this idea, we've described the lower leg as something pistol-like or piston-like. A piston is something mechanical. So this should give us an idea of how words are being used to describe this dinosaur. The idea of the piston is something mechanical, so therefore, again, adding to this idea of sheer power. It emphasizes the power and the damage that this dinosaur can do. Much like a literal piston, like an old gun, which can fire bullets very quickly and do you a lot of damage. So by comparing in a metaphorical way the dinosaur's leg to being a piston or being part of the piston of a train which pushes the wheels forwards, it's comparing the dinosaur to something mechanical, almost painting it as something android-like, half animal, half machine. And obviously, we associate these things with danger, something damage, something to do with harm. So it emphasizes the sheer power of this thing. Therefore, again, adding to this intimidating feeling of the dinosaur, which makes the reader feel fear that it could do us a lot of damage. Okay, also linking to this idea, the thick ropes of muscle. So, this idea of the rope, something that is unescapable. When I think about ropes, I think about you use ropes to tie things. But why do we use ropes? Because it's something that doesn't easily break. It's something that's thick. So it almost presents this very oppressive tone. This idea that it makes you feel very constricted and confined, so oppressive and confined or confining tone, which therefore presents this idea that's almost unescapable. It's almost something that we're not going to get away from. It's this feeling of being trapped. So yes, on a literal level, we could say it presents the dinosaur as strong because ropes don't break. However, go a step further. I associate this with we use rope to stop things from moving because it's strong. It creates this feeling of being trapped. That if I was tied in rope, I wouldn't be able to escape. Therefore, it makes me feel very confined, very oppressed, very trapped. So see how I've started to build to make a perceptive point. So it's this idea of being unescapable, of being trapped, therefore presenting the dinosaur as once again a powerful force of evil, a powerful force that is out there to do us harm. Okay, and we've got plenty of metaphors to add to this. For example, the fence of teeth, quite heavily linking to our idea of entrapment, linking it to the rope. We have an old age idiom that says this to do with feeling fenced off. So the fence is quite often a metaphor for entrapment. It's a metaphor quite often of feeling stuck. So it's entrapment or stuck in one place. So the idea of the fence of teeth, yes, on a literal level, the teeth might look straight. They might look like quite literally like a fence in your back garden. But on a more literal level, we've got this idea of feeling trapped or stuck, this inescapable feeling once again. But also think about the shape of the fence. More often than not, fences come shaped with this little spiky bit on the top. So yes, on a literal level, the teeth might look like a fence, but they are sharp. And because they are sharp, they can do us damage and injury. So it's something that feels like it's trapping us, but also something that creates this idea of violence and threat. So not only does this being want to trap us and keep us there, but it presents the dinosaur as a threat, as something that's very predator-like or very predatory. Okay, adding to that, we have the simile, comparing them to daggers. So again, we've got this idea of the sharpness. The daggers do us harm. They create violence and aggression. It's almost this idea of war. We only use daggers in a warlike situation. So it's almost presenting conflict between me and the dinosaur. It's painting this idea that it's me against the dinosaur, this idea of conflicts, which therefore makes the reader feel very unsettled, very uneasy, very fearful. Almost as if it's trying to put you in fight or flight response, trying to make my heart go faster, get more blood to my muscles as if I am going to fight this dinosaur. Okay. And then finally adding to that, we have this idea of the ivory and steel mesh. So steel mesh and ivory are two very hard materials. So this imagery is almost adding to this idea that this is not just an animal, this is a hybrid creature. Steel mesh is something metallic, again, something associated with our android. So it's presenting it as almost a hybrid creature that is powerful and difficult to stop. Very difficult, let's put difficult to defeat. Very strong as well. Okay, and let's start to, as we end the session, start to think about some of the other similes and personification. So let's start with our delicate watchmaker arms. So this is a difficult one to begin to sort of pick out why it said this. But let's think about the watchmaker. Someone who makes watches. Watches are a very delicate thing. There's something that's very difficult to make because of all the small pieces. So the fact that it's personifying the dinosaur as almost a watchmaker, it's almost kind of giving this idea of precision. This idea of skill. This dinosaur is very skilled. So if we add this to everything that we've already covered about it being a violent force that's out there to kill us, that's all powerful, that's android-like, that's resulting in war, it almost adds to the fear factor of this dinosaur that it's so skilled that it might not miss. That whatever it throws at us, whatever attack it makes, is going to hit the target. So this watchmaker almost creates or gives connotations of precision and skill, presenting the beast as an intelligent force. So it's not just some random predator like a lion or a tiger. It's something that's actually intelligent and very capable of doing significant damage, capable of planning an attack and doing damage. Planning. I'll put a strategic attack to do damage. Okay. Um, and then we've got the armor of a terrible warrior, this idea of the armor. People wear armor in war to protect themselves. It almost therefore suggests that this dinosaur is difficult to kill because it's invulnerable. It's an invulnerability. It's almost, again, presenting it as something that's all powerful because it's protecting itself with its armor. So we kind of give connotations of the armor to being something that's unstoppable. It's an aggressive force of war. Therefore, making the reader feel a sense of dread because we cannot defeat this thing. And then finally, actually, two more things. Let's go with the empty of all expression save hunger. We get this personification. It's almost presenting the dinosaur as having feelings, except in the opposite, it's telling us that the dinosaur has no feelings. So it's personifying the dinosaur as being basically empty of all feeling. So it's devoid of emotion. And why is this significant in telling the reader something about the dinosaur? Because it's saying that this dinosaur is basically defined by primal instincts. That it has no morality, no sense of right or wrong. It is purely a hungry animal that's craving food, and we, unfortunately, are its snack. So there is no remorse, no mercy. And then finally, we'll cap it all off with this idea of the death grin, this metaphorical personification. So pretty explanatory. Something is grinning. It feels some happiness. Except we came across the word sinister before. If something is sinister, it's evil and intends to do us harm. And I would argue that the death grin almost gives a very sinister tone. Like it's out there to do us harm. So this idea of the connotations of death are something eerie, something unsettling, because humans have an innate fear of what comes after death or life beyond death. It's almost in its tone creating a mocking feeling. Death is something that's scary. It's something that makes the reader feel unsettled. But we're almost contrasting it to this idea of the grin. People grin because they're mocking, they're happy. So it almost feels like the dinosaur is mocking because you've got that contrast between the happiness of the grin and the sinister nature of the death. So it presents the dinosaur as almost a predator mocking its prey or toying with its food. Okay, so therefore, what can we say about the dinosaur? We could argue that it finds pleasure in violence or in its aggression. So yes, it's a violent force, but it enjoys being a violent force. It enjoys the killing. Okay, so that is everything for today. Um, Next week, we'll move on to look at some more language techniques and continue to build. But I hope you can take away the points that I made about always referring to tone and atmosphere in your writing and your Peter paragraphs when you talk about the effect on the reader, and how our use of, or our nuanced use of metaphors and similes can add to this idea of what it makes you feel as a reader and what it makes you think about in order to make our perceptive points beyond the literal, because that's really how you get the higher marks. So, yes, go over the tone and the atmosphere sentence enders, sentence starters that I gave you. Go over this. Try at home to do past papers. Try to build perceptive points, thinking about how words make you feel, what they make you think about, and then build from there. But yeah, thank you for coming this week, and I will see you next week when we do more or cover some of the more language techniques. Okay.